I made a video. You can check out the video. I'll leave it in the card. I'll leave a link in the description. Pretty much talking about the Apple backdoor. Ars Technica and a lot of people call this a backdoor. And essentially what happened is there was some debugging tool. It's assumed to be a debugging tool from the researcher. So this is the person that we have the most amount of trust in regarding the story because they're the person that discovered this, and they had to pretty much reverse engineer all of these Apple components to figure out what the hell's going on. And they even said that this seems to be a possible debugging tool or some kind of feature built into these chips that's used for like internal Apple usage, likely for debugging purposes. Now, a lot of people were kind of, and I didn't do the best job at this either, because I still want to work inside the scope of, yes, it likely is a backdoor, but some people were interpreting my video as he's saying it's not a backdoor. And so it actually brought up an interesting discussion because there's another incident where there was military chips that had backdoors, like Chinese chips in the US military that had backdoors. And the US government was calling these backdoors, but then a US researcher came forward and said, hey, these are actually debugging tools. They were never like intentionally put in to be backdoors. So now there's a whole debate of like, well, at what point does something become an intentional backdoor? And if it's not an intentional backdoor, is it still considered a backdoor? And what are the, I guess, what are the pros and cons of labeling things in certain ways? So I just think it's an interesting discussion that we're going to get into. And I actually don't really know any of your thoughts on this because after I posted the video, I went into the group chat with you and our clips editor, and I'm like, hey, am I crazy? Like, I was like, am I insane? And you both were like, no, I think anyone who wanted to like listen to that video and get a good perspective on it would have like got the right message from it. But people who are just going to be like Apple haters are going to be like Apple haters. People who are Apple lovers are going to be Apple lovers. So did I miss something?
No, yeah, it's absolutely like it's a complicated topic for sure. When you're talking about like stuff like backdoor, stuff like honeypot, stuff that you said has like a lot of gray areas surrounding the definition of it. Even like experts will disagree or come up with different definitions based on like the article that you're reading or that kind of thing. It's all like slightly different and slightly different in everybody's mind what exactly you're referring to in the first place, which makes talking about this kind of stuff difficult, I think.
Right. And I guess just to, before we get into like why this matters, I'm gonna have B-roll for this, but there's a China-made U.S. military chip, security backdoor or debugging functionality is the title of this article. This is from 2012. But and I'm quoting the article here. A different view has been provided by Robert Graham, U.S. security consultancy at Erratica Security, that has declared that the discovered bug hasn't malicious purpose. It is an entry point installed by the manufacturer for debugging operations. And he said that a backdoor could pose a security threat. Essentially, he's not saying that there's not an issue here. He's just saying that clearly this was not put in for intentionally malicious purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess why does this matter? First off, like what is the difference between something being an actively malicious backdoor put in for the sole purpose of being a backdoor versus something that's just a tool that's ultimately utilized to become a backdoor
Yeah,
because it
I
was
mean,
exploited?
from a technical perspective, the only difference is like whether one party knows about it beforehand or not. But at the end of the day, there is a backdoor in your device. Whether like somebody had to go through the effort of trying all these debugging tools or whatever, maybe, and trying to see if they can be exploited to grant that access, or whether it was designed to grant unauthorized access to sensitive information in the first place. Either way, at the end of the day, you're going to be affected, right?
Right. I guess, do you see a positive to it being proven not to be an active backdoor? Like, what is the positive in that, if any?
Um, well, it's definitely worse, like from the perspective of the company that's like producing these iPhones. Like for if it's discovered to be intentional, like if Apple wasn't behind this backdoor, but they discovered like their manufacturing partner was involved in adding this secret code that they didn't know about, for example, or something like that, that would be of concern to them. But um, either way, for the people who are affected, I don't know if it makes a huge difference, to be honest.
Right. That makes sense. I think also it matters from a long term trust perspective
Right.
because if a company or a service or a chip or whatever it is, this applies to anything, if it was put in intentionally for the sole purpose of allowing other people to access customer data. That's an instant loss of trust right there.
Hmm.
But if somebody screws up, I guess there's a little bit more sympathy you can have because it wasn't intentionally done. So in the case of Apple, again, if it comes out, if the researcher comes out with an update that straight up has evidence and says Apple clearly put this in on purpose because they collaborated, and to be fair, if it was an actual research paper, he wouldn't probably have the context as to why it was put in. He would just be able to say, based on my evidence and based on what I'm seeing, it seems like it was actively put in for the sole purpose of exploitation, which, by the way, nothing aligns with that. Because if anyone who actually read the article and saw the exploit chain, no backdoor would have to rely on such an insane exploit chain to be utilized if the sole purpose of the backdoor was to be exploited. And this also is kind of debunked by the fact that Apple literally closed up so many of the exploits in the exploit chain without necessarily dealing with that root problem, as far as I know. So it just seems a little silly to like hop on that I think it's a conspiracy theory, to be honest, to say that it was an intentional backdoor, because there's no evidence for it. That's not where the data aligns, and to go against that is almost, it's very accusatory at minimum, I'd say. And I would think about this for any other exploit for a different company. If this was Microsoft, if Microsoft had a similar chip exploitation in their own silicon, and I would also go, okay, but like, I don't know if that's necessarily intentionally put in, but the negligence is still a red flag. And I think that they should be doing better.
Right.
And
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say, like, what, because so much goes into these chip designs, right? They're incredibly complex chips that are being designed, and there could be so many functions that are undocumented or people have no idea why it exists because somebody just built it one day. It feels most likely to me that it's just like probably a debugging thing or something like that, as the article mentioned, that they forgot to disable it or that kind of thing. Because it's so easy to just forget to turn that kind of thing off or just leave it there and not even know what it does. And it's safer to ignore it, right? From a chip design perspective, if that's going to mess up your whole chip. But obviously, from a security perspective, it's even a problem with software. People, like developers, are building more complex and more complex software, and all this code, a lot of people don't even know what it does anymore. It just builds up over time, and it could be like something that's been in ARM chips for like 10 years that just nobody remembered or knew about until now, that kind of thing, right?
right.